Hey guys, tonight we slip out beyond the late-night windows of Earth and drift toward one of the calmest sights in the solar system. A planet so elegant it almost looks invented, as if somebody gave space a sense of style and then quietly stopped at Saturn. You can picture it already, hanging in the dark with that pale gold glow and those impossible rings stretched around it like a soft, luminous whisper. Before you get cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending time here with me. And if you feel like it, post your location and your local time in the comments, because I always love the idea that while we meet here in this quiet corner of the night, some of you are listening under deep midnight skies, and some of you are just beginning the morning. Let the world slow down for a moment. Let the fan murmur softly nearby, and let's slip into tonight's journey together. From far away, Saturn does not rush to impress you. That is part of its charm. It does not blaze across the sky like the sun, and it does not fill your view the way the moon does. It simply waits there, far beyond the warmth of Earth, beyond Mars, beyond the busy region where most people casually imagine the solar system stopping, and it glows with this quiet patience that feels almost polite. Even through a small telescope, Saturn has a way of making people pause. Not because it is loud or dramatic, but because it seems too graceful to be real. You look at it once and your brain does that small, wonderful stumble. A planet should be a round thing. Simple, clean, nicely spherical. Saturn, however, arrives wearing a halo, which is rude, honestly, because now every other planet has to explain itself. Jupiter is magnificent, of course. Mars has its charm. Venus has drama, but Saturn has rings, and rings are unfair. The relaxing part is that the rings are not just decorative from our human point of view. They are real structures, spread across an enormous distance, floating in perfect silence around a world made mostly of hydrogen and helium. Saturn itself is the second largest planet in the solar system, so large that more than 700 Earths could fit inside it by volume, though it is much less dense than you might expect for something so huge. If you could find an ocean absurdly large enough, Saturn would, in theory, float. That fact has followed it around for years because it sounds like the universe telling a joke in a very straight face. And still, for all its size, Saturn often feels defined by those rings. They catch light in a way that makes the whole planet seem delicate, though Saturn is anything but small. The rings reflect sunlight beautifully because they are made mostly of water ice. That is one of the loveliest facts about them. The grand silver bands you see from afar are built largely from ice, mixed with smaller amounts of rock and dust, each piece orbiting Saturn on its own path. Some pieces are tiny like grains, some are larger like boulders, and together they create the smooth, shining shape your eyes read as a single elegant design. That illusion is part of what makes Saturn so soothing to think about. From a distance, the rings seem calm and continuous, like silk laid carefully around the planet. Up close, they are a crowd. Countless icy fragments, each following gravity, each moving at tremendous speed, and yet together they form something that looks serene. It is a little like listening to rain from inside a warm room. You know each drop is separate. You know there is motion, collision, and constant activity. But the overall feeling is softness. If you were somehow able to drift near the rings themselves, the first surprise would be how much empty space there is. In paintings and diagrams, the rings often look solid, almost like the grooves of a giant record. In reality, they are made of particles spread across a huge area, and even though there are places where material is crowded together more densely, much of the ring system is still open enough that you would not feel trapped inside some frozen wall. You would be moving through a vast field of orbiting ice, with sunlight catching edges and faces and little spinning surfaces, turning them bright and then dim again. And the scale of it is quietly ridiculous. The main rings stretch across hundreds of thousands of kilometers. If Saturn vanished and you kept only the broad width of the ring system, it would still be one of the most astonishing structures in the solar system. Yet for all that width, the rings are also astonishingly thin compared with how wide they are. In many places, they are only tens of meters thick, with some regions thicker and some thinner, but still delicate compared with their diameter. A structure so wide and so thin sounds almost impossible, like a thought experiment somebody sketched on a napkin and then accidentally left in orbit around a giant planet. That thinness helps give the rings their graceful appearance. They are like a great celestial sheet laid carefully flat by motion and gravity. Saturn's pull keeps the particles in orbit, and over time those countless bits of ice tend to settle into a shared plane. The result is something that feels organized without looking rigid, ordered but never stiff. You can almost sense the balance in it. And balance is really the secret mood of Saturn. Everything there seems to move with a kind of slow confidence. Saturn takes about 29.5 Earth years to go once around the Sun, so a single year on Saturn lasts nearly 3 decades for us. Seasons there linger. Light changes slowly. Shadows take their time. Even that alone makes the planet feel dreamy, as if the entire world exists on a slower clock and has no particular interest in hurrying for anyone. The sunlight out there is weaker than what reaches Earth, because Saturn is so far from the Sun, nearly 1.5 billion kilometers away on average. By the time sunlight gets there, it is gentler, thinner, less forceful. And yet it is enough. Enough to set the rings glowing. Enough to paint Saturn in pale gold and soft cream. Enough to make one of the coldest places in the solar system look warm from a distance, which feels like a very classic space trick. That warmth is only visual, of course. Saturn and its rings are profoundly cold. The ring particles sit in a region where temperatures can drop to around -180 degrees Celsius, depending on the season and the exact location. But when you imagine them, you do not usually imagine cold first. You imagine beauty first. That is the strange kindness of light. It can turn ice into radiance. It can make something remote feel almost welcoming. Long before spacecraft arrived, Saturn already had this dreamy reputation. Early skywatchers could see it with the naked eye as a wandering point of light, though the rings remained hidden until telescopes improved. When Galileo first looked at Saturn in 1610, his telescope was not strong enough to clearly show what the rings were, so the planet appeared oddly shaped, with what looked like mysterious companions attached to it. He could see that something was strange, but not yet what it meant. It must have been one of the most maddeningly gentle mysteries in astronomy, a planet refusing to explain its silhouette. Later observers with better instruments began to understand that Saturn was surrounded by a ring, and then eventually by multiple rings. Over time, the picture grew more detailed, more intricate, and somehow more enchanting. The closer science looked, the more subtle the system became, not less magical, more. That is one of the nicest things about astronomy when it is doing its job properly. The facts do not flatten the wonder, they give it texture. And Saturn rewards that kind of attention. Even the simple act of watching it through a telescope can feel strangely intimate. You are seeing something so far away that the light reaching your eye has traveled for well over an hour. Saturn is not sending you a fresh image of itself. It is sending you a slightly older one, as if it believes in arriving fashionably late. You look up, and what you see is a delayed gift from the outer solar system. Keep that image nearby because it matters. A pale planet, a thin shining ring, sunlight that has traveled outward, touched ice, and turned back toward you. Already there is enough calm in that picture to stay with you a long time, and we have not even drifted close to the ring particles yet, or watched how they move, or seen how moons quietly shape them from the edges. For the moment, it is enough just to remain here at this first beautiful distance, where Saturn hangs in the dark like a thought the universe took its time with. From that first beautiful distance, where Saturn looked almost too elegant to belong to ordinary physics, you can begin to move a little closer, and the most comforting surprise is that the rings are not some solid piece of cosmic decoration. They are made of pieces, countless pieces, real little bodies of ice and dust and rock, each one orbiting Saturn on its own path, each one catching light for a moment and then letting it go again. That fact alone changes the whole feeling of the scene. The rings seem smooth when you see them from far away. They seem almost painted on, as if someone drew a bright line around the planet and called it a masterpiece. But the truth is quieter and more interesting. Saturn's rings are mostly water ice. Plain old water, in frozen form, scattered into one of the most graceful structures in the solar system. There is something deeply relaxing about that. The grand shining architecture around this giant planet is built largely from the same substance that drifts from winter clouds and settles on rooftops back on Earth. Only out here it has been given scale, silence, and a better view. The ice is not all identical. Some pieces are tiny, closer to grains or pebbles. Some are much larger, like houses, or even bigger. They do not arrive in one neat size, and they do not sit politely in little labeled trays. They are a wild collection, but a beautiful one, ranging across many shapes and sizes, all moving together in that broad, flattened band. From a distance, your eye blends them into brightness. Up close, the ring system would feel more like an enormous field of orbiting fragments, with gaps between them, clusters here and there, and sunlight flashing off spinning surfaces in sudden little glints. That brightness matters because it tells you something real about what the rings are made of. Saturn's rings reflect a great deal of sunlight, much more than darker rocky material would. That high reflectivity is one of the reasons astronomers know the rings contain so much ice. They are bright because ice is bright, especially when it is fresh and clean by cosmic standards. Not perfectly clean, of course. Space is never quite that tidy. Mixed in with the water ice are darker materials, including bits of rock and dust and compounds that dull the shine a little. Some parts of the rings look brighter than others, and some of that comes from differences in how much non-icy material has gathered there over time. Even so, the overall impression is still luminous. When you look at Saturn through a telescope, the rings do not look heavy. They look pale, thin, almost delicate. That visual softness comes from their icy nature. You are looking at frozen material spread over an enormous area, lit by weak sunlight that has traveled all the way out from the sun and still found enough strength to turn those particles into silver-gold ribbons. There is also a strange comfort in the fact that the rings are not ancient in the same way Saturn itself is ancient. Saturn formed early in the history of the solar system, more than 4 billion years ago. The rings may be much younger, though astronomers are still working on that story. Their relative brightness suggests they may not have had endless ages to gather too much dark dust. Something may have broken apart long after Saturn formed, perhaps an icy moon or a comet-like body torn apart by gravity. The details are still being debated gently, which is very on brand for Saturn. Even its mysteries seem to speak in a lower voice. And that idea gives the rings a different kind of beauty. They are not just part of the furniture. They may be the remains of something older reshaped into something softer, a broken world turned into a shining band. There is no need to rush that image. Just keep it nearby. Ice fragments, once part of a larger object, moving together in shared orbit, making something far more graceful than the thing that was lost. The icy particles themselves live in a place of constant motion. They circle Saturn quickly, but not all at the same speed. The particles closer to Saturn move faster than the ones farther out. That sounds technical at first, but it feels very natural once you imagine it. In the same way that the inner lanes of a running track are shorter, the inner parts of the ring system complete their loops more quickly. Saturn's gravity organizes that motion with incredible precision. No conductor is standing out there with a baton. No cosmic traffic officer is blowing a whistle. The rules of gravity are enough. Because the particles are separate, they can also bump, nudge, and influence one another. These are usually not dramatic collisions in the way movies like to pretend everything in space is either exploding or extremely annoyed. Much of the time, the encounters are gentler. Small impacts, tiny adjustments, little trades of momentum. Over time, those interactions help shape the ring system, keeping many particles moving in a fairly orderly plane. That is one reason the rings can look so calm even though they are full of activity. There is motion everywhere, but it has settled into rhythm. And rhythm is the better word for Saturn. The rings are not frozen in the sense of being still. They are frozen in material, but alive in movement. Every bright strip you see is really motion organized so well that it becomes beauty. You are looking at physics that has learned manners. Some parts of the rings contain more densely packed material than others. The famous main rings, usually named the A, B, and C rings, each have their own character. Some are brighter and thicker with material. Some are more transparent and subtle. The naming sounds a little backwards because the order came from history rather than from a neat outer twinner logic, which feels very human. We reach one of the most exquisite structures in the solar system and immediately label it in a way that suggests someone was sorting office folders in a hurry. Still, the name stayed, and over time they became familiar. The B ring is generally the brightest and most massive of the main visible rings. The ring lies farther out, broad and striking. The C ring is closer in and more faint, almost ghostly in places. Beyond those lie other fainter rings too, less obvious to the casual viewer but very much part of Saturn's extended family of orbiting material. The whole system is more layered than it first appears, almost like music heard from another room. At first you notice the melody. After a while, you begin to hear the texture. That texture is part of what makes Saturn so restful to think about. The rings are not one thing. They are many things behaving together: water, ice, dust, rocky fragments, shadow, light, motion, distance, time. Even the color is subtle. In ordinary images, they look white or pale gold, but that depends on lighting and angle. Their brightness changes with the season, with the tilt, with the sun's position, with where you happen to be watching from. Saturn never completely stops being Saturn, but it does enjoy changing the mood of the room. There is another lovely detail hidden in all this. Because the rings are made of so many separate particles, they are not silent in the imaginative sense. Not because you would hear a neat little chime if you floated nearby. Space does not really hand out sound that generously. But the ring system has a texture your mind can almost hear. A soft suggestion of countless icy bodies moving in relation to each other, as if the whole scene were one vast visual whisper. And the more you understand what the rings are made of, the more tender they seem. They are not a rigid crown placed on Saturn forever. They are a temporary arrangement of fragile pieces, held in motion, held in light, held in balance. That makes them feel less like an object and more like a moment that has been going on for a very long time. A moment, though, with structure, because as you keep drifting alongside those shining bands, another detail starts to emerge. The rings are not evenly spread. They are divided, braided, separated into narrow ringlets and dark gaps, with some regions crowded and some strangely open. From far away, it all looks smooth. Up close, the calm becomes more intricate and the real artistry begins to show. From that closer view, where the rings stop looking like a single band and begin to reveal their many separate lives, the next soothing truth is all about motion. Everything here is moving, and almost nothing is moving in exactly the same way. The peace of Saturn's rings comes from that delicate contradiction. It looks calm because the movement is so beautifully organized. If you could remain beside the rings long enough to truly feel their rhythm, you would notice that the particles nearest Saturn sweep around the planet more quickly than the ones farther away. That is one of the first quiet laws that gives the whole system its shape. Saturn's gravity is stronger closer in, so the inner ring particles travel faster in their orbits. The outer ones move more slowly, taking longer to complete the same grand circle. It is not random. It is not chaotic in the careless sense. It is ordered, measured, and steady, as if the entire ring system has agreed to keep time without ever needing to speak. That changing speed is the reason the rings cannot behave like a single solid disk. If the whole thing were one rigid plate, the inner parts and outer parts would have to move together, and nature has no interest in allowing that. Gravity prefers a more elegant arrangement. It gives each particle its own path, its own pace, its own place in the larger pattern. The rings are peaceful because they are not forced into stiffness. They are allowed to remain many things at once. You can picture it with something simple. Imagine leaves floating around the center of a slow whirlpool. The ones close to the middle circle quickly. The ones farther out move in wider, gentler paths. Saturn's rings are far more precise than that, of course, and far more beautiful, but the feeling is similar. The inner regions hurry a little more. The outer regions take their time. Together, they create a broad motion that your eye reads as one smooth, shining structure. The detail is busy. The whole is graceful. That graceful motion has fascinated astronomers for centuries because it turns something that could have been messy into something almost musical. Not musical in the sense of melody drifting through space, though people have certainly enjoyed imagining that. More like rhythm, pattern, repetition, a system where each orbit is a kind of silent beat, and the whole ring plane becomes a vast record spinning in darkness. The comparison is a little unfair to records because Saturn's rings are much more subtle. A record is solid and neatly grooved. The rings are looser, more alive, more changeable. Still, the image helps. You have this broad circular system, flattened into a plane, circling with exquisite discipline around a central world. It does not rush for you. It does not pause for you either. It simply continues, hour after hour, year after year, age after age, with the sort of confidence only gravity seems able to produce. And gravity really is the patient artist here. It shapes the paths, holds the particles in orbit, and keeps the whole ring system from wandering away into the dark. Every ice fragment is falling towards Saturn in one sense, but it is also moving sideways so quickly that it keeps missing the planet, curving around it again and again. That is the gentle secret of orbit, a kind of endless falling that never quite arrives. Once you feel that idea properly, orbit stops sounding mechanical and starts sounding almost tender. The particles do not float aimlessly. They are continuously responding to Saturn's mass, to their own speed, and to the presence of neighboring particles and moons. Some collide softly. Some exchange a bit of energy. Some are nudged into slightly different paths. Over long stretches of time, these tiny interactions can smooth things out, flattening the system and helping maintain the ring plane. A place this vast is shaped partly by little touches. That feels worth remembering. Those touches do not always create simplicity. In fact, they often create texture. Because the inner particles move faster than the outer ones, neighboring regions are always sliding past each other at slightly different rates. One narrow ringlet can lap another over time. One patch of particles can stretch and shear gently as orbital speed changes with distance. This is why the rings can develop fine structure rather than blending into one bland sheet. Motion itself becomes an artist, pulling out lines and ripples from the raw material. The wonderful thing is that you do not need advanced mathematics to feel the beauty of it. You can sense it the way you sense waves repeating on a shore, or the way clouds spread along a wind pattern, or the way traffic from high above almost looks orderly enough to forgive. Saturn's rings are a lesson in how many separate motions can settle into a single calm impression. Underneath the serenity there is speed. Underneath the speed there is law. Underneath the law there is a kind of simplicity that feels deeply restful. Some particles in the main rings complete an orbit in just a matter of hours. That means while you are quietly finishing an evening on Earth, somewhere in Saturn's ring system entire loops have already been completed. Little icy fragments have traveled huge circular paths and returned to familiar positions, still shining faintly in the outer sunlight. The scale is enormous, but the repetition is intimate. Over and over, around and around, almost politely. Saturn seems to love a slow spectacle built from quick details. And because different parts of the rings move at different speeds, the system is never frozen in one exact arrangement. It keeps evolving in small ways. Clumps can spread, patterns can stretch, edges can sharpen or blur. The rings you admire are stable on the whole but lively in the details, more like weathered silk in motion than a carved object. The beauty is not trapped, it is renewed every orbit. This is one reason spacecraft images of the rings can feel so mesmerizing. The closer you look, the more the supposed stillness starts to breathe. Bright bands seem to flow past dark lanes. Narrow ringlets sit alongside broader sheets of material. Subtle waves appear where gravity has disturbed the local rhythm. The eye starts to understand that this is not a static halo. It is an active system, forever rearranging tiny pieces without losing its overall composure. There is also something comforting in how impartial the motion is. Saturn does not play favorites. It pulls on everything according to the same quiet rules. A bright ice chunk and a darker dusty fragment both answer to gravity. A large particle and a smaller one both take their places in the dance, though not always in identical ways. The system is fair in that deeply cosmic manner, where fairness has nothing to do with kindness and everything to do with consistency. And consistency, late at night, can feel like its own form of kindness anyway. If you stay with that image long enough, the rings begin to seem less like jewelry and more like time made visible. Repetition without boredom, motion without panic, precision without strain. It is such a soft kind of grandeur. Nothing in the ring system needs to announce itself loudly. Even the speed remains graceful because the distances are so large and the patterns so smooth. A particle can be racing along, and the whole scene still feels unhurried. Space has a gift for that. It can take something fast and spread it across such a wide canvas that it looks almost still. Keep that feeling nearby, because it becomes even more interesting when the motion meets interruption. The rings are not one endless, uninterrupted field. There are dark gaps, bright concentrations, narrow divisions, and delicate ringlets where the rhythm changes just enough for structure to appear. The same gravity that keeps everything moving also opens quiet spaces between the shining bands, and those spaces turn out to be some of the most beautiful parts of all. The more time you spend beside Saturn, the stranger its beauty becomes, because the rings do something that feels almost impossible. From a distance they look broad and grand, a huge shining system wrapped around the planet with effortless elegance. Yet when you begin to understand their shape more clearly, you find out that this enormous structure is also incredibly thin. Not thin in a poetic way. Thin in a real physical way, so thin compared with its width that the mind has to pause and adjust. It helps to hold both facts together at once. Saturn's main rings spread outward across hundreds of thousands of kilometers. They are vast, easily one of the widest structures associated with any planet in the solar system. But their thickness, in many places, is only measured in tens of meters, with some regions thicker and some thinner. So you have this astonishing arrangement, wider than the distance across many entire worlds, yet flatter than almost anything your intuition wants to allow. It is like seeing a lake that stretches beyond the horizon, and then learning it is somehow only as deep as a modest building is tall. The scale feels mismatched, and that mismatch is part of the charm. This is why the rings can sometimes seem to almost disappear. When you view them edge-on, their great width stops helping you. All that remains is their thickness, and their thickness is so slight that from far away they turn into a delicate line. Sometimes even that line becomes hard to see. Saturn, that famously elegant planet with the dramatic halo, can suddenly look plain and oddly stripped down, as if the universe briefly misplaced its most stylish accessory. There is something deeply calming about that vanishing act. The rings are still there. All that ice is still orbiting. All the motion continues, but your angle changes and the whole structure becomes a whisper. It is a quiet reminder that even the grandest things in space depend on perspective. Magnificence can become subtle without becoming smaller in any real sense. The reason the rings are so flat comes from the same patient rules that shape everything else around Saturn. The particles are all moving in orbit, and over long stretches of time, collisions between them help smooth out any wild differences in their motions. If one particle tilts a little above the main plane and another drifts a little below, their interactions tend to reduce that vertical wandering. Energy gets traded, motion gets softened. The system gradually settles into a shared layer around Saturn's equator, a common orbital plane that becomes flatter and flatter because nature, given enough time, often prefers balance over clutter. That process is not perfect in the sense of creating a single razor sheet with no texture. The rings still have local variations. Some regions are puffier, some are more compact. There are places where waves or clumps or gravitational nudges make the structure more complicated, but the overall effect remains astonishingly flat. The particles have spent such a long time adjusting to one another that the ring system has become a kind of cosmic compromise, a place where countless separate objects have agreed, more or less, to travel together in the same broad plane. That shared plane matters because Saturn itself is not standing upright as it goes around the Sun. The planet is tilted, much like Earth is tilted, though by a slightly larger amount. That tilt is what gives Saturn seasons. It is also what changes how the rings appear from Earth over time. Sometimes the rings are opened beautifully toward us, showing their broad, bright faces. At other times they tip toward edge-on, and the whole system narrows until it looks almost impossibly slight. Astronomers call these moments ring plane crossings, and they happen in a cycle as Saturn continues its long journey around the Sun. You do not need the term to enjoy the image, though. It is enough to imagine a giant luminous sheet slowly turning in space. One year it offers its full shining surface. Years later it becomes a blade of light. Then slowly it opens again. The same rings, the same particles, a different angle. Saturn seems to understand better than most planets that timing is part of beauty. And there is another gentle detail tucked inside this thinness. The rings are not thin because they are weak. They are thin because motion has organized them so well. That is a much more interesting kind of delicacy. They are fragile in one sense, yes. They are made of separate icy pieces, not welded together into permanence. But their flatness is also a sign of discipline, of structure earned over time. You are not looking at something flimsy. You are looking at something refined. The visual result is almost absurdly elegant. When sunlight strikes the rings at an angle, that thin plane can glow with a soft metallic brightness, while the shadow it casts on Saturn creates this serene contrast between brilliance and shade. And when the Sun is low relative to the ring plane, tiny vertical structures within the rings can begin to matter more, creating subtle shadows and textures that reveal just how delicate the system really is. Even very small differences become visible when the light skims across such a flat expanse. It is one of those cases where science makes the image gentler rather than colder. Knowing that the rings are not thick slabs, but a flattened cloud of orbiting ice gives them a tenderness they would not otherwise have. The beauty stops feeling decorative and starts feeling improbable. This giant planet has managed to gather a broad field of frozen particles into a plane so slender that it can nearly vanish from view, then return again like something remembered. And from nearby, that flatness would not look empty. It would look layered with motion. The particles would still be tracing their paths, still glinting, still shifting around one another, while the whole structure remained astonishingly compressed in the vertical direction. Wide beyond comfort, thin beyond reason, Saturn somehow gets away with it. The mind likes solid things, thick things, objects with obvious volume. Saturn offers something different, a great spread of material with almost no apparent depth at the scale of its width. It feels less like architecture and more like calligraphy, a single pale stroke drawn carefully around a planet. That is not scientifically precise, of course, but it gets close to the emotional truth. The rings do not merely surround Saturn, they define the grace of its silhouette. You can see why early observers were confused. Even with better telescopes, Saturn never gives up its geometry all at once. It reveals itself gradually. First, the surprise that it has rings at all. Then the realization that the rings are separate from the planet. Then the deeper surprise that they are not solid. Then this quieter marvel that they are unbelievably thin. Each new layer of understanding makes the whole scene feel more delicate and more grand at the same time. That strange combination stays with you. Broad and narrow, massive and airy, bright and nearly invisible, depending on where you stand. Saturn's rings teach perspective so gently that it hardly feels like being taught. They simply keep changing shape in your mind until you stop expecting simple things from them. And once you begin looking for that finer structure, the next details start to appear almost by themselves. The rings are not just flat, they are divided, split by dark spaces, braided into ringlets, broken into subtle lanes where gravity has cleared, crowded, or tuned the material into different bands. The thin line begins to separate into many thinner lines, and that quiet complexity is where Saturn becomes even more beautiful. Once you start seeing the rings as something fine and structured rather than as one simple band of light, Saturn becomes much harder to leave. The broad halo you noticed at first begins to open into quieter details, and one of the loveliest of them is this. The rings are full of spaces. Not blank spaces exactly, and not empty in the way the word usually sounds, but dark lanes, narrow divisions, delicate separations, and thin little strands that turn the whole system into something more intricate than any first glance would suggest. From far away, the rings look smooth enough to calm you. From closer in, they calm you in a different way, because they reveal order inside the beauty. There are bright bands with more material gathered together, and there are darker regions where much less is present. Some of those darker regions are wide enough to stand out clearly even in telescope views. Others are so fine that they only truly reveal themselves in close observations from spacecraft. The result is a ring system that feels less like a solid object and more like a woven thing, something layered, separated, and gently tuned. One of the most famous of these dark spaces is the Cassini division, the broad gap between Saturn's B ring and a ring. Even the name has a certain quiet dignity to it. A division sounds more polite than a void, and in this case polite is about right. The Cassini division is not simply an empty break carved through the rings like a clean cut. It contains material, just much less of it than the brighter bands on either side. That is true of many gaps in Saturn's rings. They are often not completely vacant. They are places where gravity, motion, and repeated nudges have made it difficult for ring particles to remain densely settled. That subtlety matters. Saturn is always more delicate than the simplified version. A gap is not always a perfect absence. A ring is not always a perfect wall. Everything here comes in gradients, layers, and changing densities. It is part of what makes the system so soothing to think about. It resists bluntness. Even its emptiness is nuanced. The reason many of these gaps exist has to do with orbital resonance, which sounds like something a textbook would say right before making you regret being awake, but it is actually a beautiful idea when you slow it down. A resonance happens when ring particles orbit Saturn in a simple repeating relationship with one of Saturn's moons. If a moon goes around Saturn once in a certain amount of time, and a particle in the ring goes around twice in that same time, or 3 times while the moon goes around once, those repeated patterns can add up. The moon gives the particle a small gravitational tug again and again at regular intervals, almost like a gentle push arriving at the same point in a swing's motion. One push is not much. 1,000 well-timed pushes begin to matter. Over long stretches of time, those repeated tugs can disturb the orbits of particles in certain regions and help clear out material or rearrange it. That is one reason some gaps form. Not because something smashed through the rings in a dramatic tantrum, but because quiet repetition has power. Saturn seems to enjoy proving that the universe can shape great beauty through patience rather than spectacle. And then there are the ringlets, which may be the most elegant detail of all. Inside broader rings, you often find much narrower strands, sometimes braided-looking, sometimes sharply separated, sometimes packed into groups so fine they look like grooves on a polished surface. These ringlets are not decorative extras. They are real structures created by the same slow conversation between gravity and motion that shapes the rest of the system. Some are dense and crisp. Some are faint and dusty. Some seem to ripple with subtle waves. The closer you look, the less the rings resemble a single object and the more they resemble an ecosystem of orbits. That word fits surprisingly well. The rings are not alive, of course, but they do have local character. Different regions behave differently. Some are crowded, some are sparse, some are stirred by nearby moons, some are shaped by resonances. Some show spiral density waves where the material bunches and spreads in patterns that move through the rings like ripples through a pond, though much more controlled and much less eager to show off. These waves are one of the great quiet beauties of Saturn. Gravity can ride on the rings without touching them in any solid sense. A moon can orbit at a distance, and its influence can still travel into the ring material as a repeating pattern. If you could see these structures the way a spacecraft sees them, with the light at just the right angle, the rings would not look flat and blank at all. They would look textured, almost brushed in places, almost silky in others, with dark gaps opening between brighter strands and narrow features threading through broader bands. It would feel like flying past a frozen storm that has somehow chosen calm over chaos. Some of the named gaps are very narrow, like the Encke gap within the ring, and they bring another lovely detail into view. Small moons can live within or near these gaps, helping maintain them. Their gravity disturbs nearby particles and keeps certain regions relatively clear, so even the spaces in the rings are not passive. They can be tended, shaped, maintained. Saturn does not really do simple emptiness. It does relationship. And that relationship shows up in the edges too. The borders of some rings are remarkably sharp, much sharper than you might expect if the material were just drifting freely and blending outward forever. Something is keeping those boundaries defined. Sometimes it is resonance. Sometimes it is the influence of nearby moons. Sometimes it is the collective behavior of the particles themselves. Whatever the mechanism, the effect is wonderful. The rings have seams. They have borders. They have places where brightness ends with surprising confidence, and a darker region begins. That is part of why the system keeps drawing you in. Your eyes start with the whole shape, then drift to the broad divisions, then to the narrow ringlets, then to the faint dusty strands you almost missed. Saturn rewards patience better than almost anything else in the sky. It never dumps all its beauty on the table at once. It reveals it gradually, with that same unhurried courtesy it seems to apply to everything. Even the darker regions are beautiful because they let the brighter ones breathe. The gaps create contrast. They let the rings read as music rather than noise. A broad, bright band beside a darker division feels intentional, though of course it is the product of physics and time rather than design in the human sense. Still, the emotional effect is the same. The structure feels composed. You can rest inside it. And the most comforting part may be this. What looks like emptiness is often just another form of pattern. A gap is not a failure of the rings. It is one of the ways the rings become readable. It is how motion leaves space for shape. It is how Saturn turns repetition into elegance. Keep that image nearby, because those gaps and ringlets are only part of the story. Something is shaping them with extraordinary delicacy from the edges and from beyond. Tiny moons and larger companions whose gravity combs through the rings like invisible fingers, sharpening borders, stirring waves, and quietly teaching ice how to arrange itself. Those quiet spaces and narrow ringlets do not arrange themselves entirely alone. The longer you stay with Saturn, the more you begin to feel that the rings are part of a larger conversation, and some of the gentlest voices in that conversation belong to the moons. Small moons, large moons, near moons, distant moons, each with its own orbit and timing, each pulling just enough to matter. Saturn has a great many moons, an entire busy family circling the planet, but among all of them, a few have a particularly delicate relationship with the rings. They do not dominate the scene. They shape it softly. This is one of the most relaxing truths about Saturn. Its beauty is not fixed in isolation. It is maintained through relationship. A moon passes nearby, and its gravity gives a subtle, repeated tug. A ring particle responds, perhaps by shifting its orbit slightly, perhaps by joining a wave of motion that spreads through the surrounding material. Over long spans of time, these little nudges become visible structure. A sharper edge, a cleaner gap. A ripple that travels through a ring like a memory, moving through still water. Some of Saturn's smallest moons are called shepherd moons, which may be one of the most charmingly accurate names in astronomy. They really do help shepherd the ring particles, guiding the edges of certain rings and helping keep narrow bands from spreading out too much. Not by standing there like tiny supervisors with clipboards, thankfully, but through gravity alone. They orbit near the rings, and their repeated influence can gather particles inward or push them outward, keeping a ringlet neat enough to remain recognizable. One of the best-known examples is the thin F ring, a narrow and somewhat restless ring outside the main bright rings. It is shaped in part by two small moons, Prometheus and Pandora, which orbit on either side of it. Their gravitational influence helps maintain the ring's narrow form, though maintain might sound more peaceful than the full story. The F ring is elegant, yes, but it is not perfectly calm in the way a painted line is calm. It can appear braided, kinked, and slightly disturbed, as if those nearby moons are tending it with loving hands that are just a little too enthusiastic. The result is beautiful, a narrow ring that looks alive with detail, forever being adjusted and refined. Prometheus in particular has a habit of drawing out little streamers and structures in the F ring as it passes. Its gravity pulls on the ring particles, and those particles answer in shape. It is one of the clearest examples of how Saturn's moons do not merely accompany the rings. They write on them, quietly, repeatedly, with all the patience in the world. That is really the mood of Saturn's outer system. Nothing is shouted. The moons do not storm through the rings like wrecking balls in a bad animation. They influence them with timing. The same small pull, again and again, in just the right places, becomes enough to sculpt a whole region. Resonance returns here too, that gentle idea we passed earlier, where repeated gravitational rhythms matter more than any single dramatic event. A moon does not need to be huge to shape the rings. It only needs consistency. And Saturn has no shortage of consistency. Its moons orbit with reliable grace, each tracing its own path around the planet. Some are small and irregular. Some are large enough to be little worlds in their own right. Titan, Saturn's largest moon, is bigger than the planet Mercury and wrapped in a thick atmosphere rich in nitrogen. Enceladus is smaller, brilliant with ice, and famous for spraying great plumes of water vapor and icy particles from beneath its frozen surface. Those worlds deserve entire late-night journeys of their own. But here, beside the rings, what matters most is the way moons near and far help tune the structure. Even when a moon is not sitting right beside a ring, it can still influence it through orbital resonance. A moon farther away can pull on ring particles in a repeating pattern, and if the orbital periods line up in a simple ratio, those tugs add together over time. That is how some of the ring gaps and waves are maintained. It is a little like hearing a faint rhythm from another room and realizing, after a while, that the whole house has subtly begun to move with it. The beautiful thing is that these influences do not just clear spaces, they also create waves. Some are density waves, where particles crowd together slightly in certain places and spread out in others, producing ripple-like patterns in the rings. Some are bending waves, where the ring material moves a little up and down out of the main plane, creating vertical structure so slight you would never guess it from far away. Gravity is doing something astonishing here. It is taking invisible force and turning it into visible texture. It is making the rings into a surface that records passing influences, almost like sand remembering wind. This is one reason spacecraft images of Saturn's rings can feel so deeply absorbing. The patterns are not random decoration. They are evidence of relationship. A wave here may point to the steady pull of a moon elsewhere. A crisp edge may reveal the long-term presence of a shepherd moon. A narrow gap may tell you that certain orbits are being disturbed again and again in a predictable rhythm. The rings become readable once you know how to look at them. They stop being a simple halo and become a living map of gravitational conversations. And there is something emotionally calming about that idea. Saturn is not beautiful because it sits alone in perfect stillness. Saturn is beautiful because everything around it is connected by gentle influence. The rings respond to moons. The moons respond to Saturn. Light responds to angle. Ice responds to sunlight. Motion responds to gravity. The whole system is one long act of adjustment, and yet nothing feels strained. It all has that spacious outer solar system patience, as if the universe has no interest in rushing and every interest in getting the curve exactly right. Some of the smaller moons embedded near gaps and ring edges are so subtle in their influence that you might miss them completely at first, yet their effects remain in plain sight. They help sharpen boundaries. They stir nearby particles. They create little wakes in the ring material, disturbances that spread behind them like a boat passing through calm water. Except out here there is no water, only countless fragments of ice, and the wake is made not of splashing sound but of orbital geometry. Which is a very Saturn kind of sentence, honestly. The larger moons contribute to the mood in another way. They remind you that the rings are not an isolated wonder. They belong to a vast system. Beyond the bright ring plane lie whole worlds, some smooth with ice, some dark and cratered, some geologically active, some wrapped in thick haze. Saturn is not merely a planet with accessories. It is a kingdom of orbiting companions, and the rings are one voice among many. Keep that nearby, because it changes the feeling of the light. When you next look at Saturn's rings, you are not just looking at frozen material circling a giant planet. You are looking at a structure continually shaped by neighboring worlds. And that becomes even more beautiful when sunlight begins to shift across the system, when the rings brighten or fade, when shadows stretch over Saturn's clouds, and the same graceful architecture starts to change with the seasons. Once you begin to feel the moons working quietly at the edges, shaping the rings with little repeated touches, the light itself starts to seem more alive too. Saturn is one of those rare places where sunlight does not merely illuminate a scene. It changes the mood of the whole system. The same rings that looked bright and open a while ago can become muted, narrow, golden, pale, almost ghost-like, depending on where the sun is, where Saturn is in its long year, and where you happen to be watching from. That changing light is one of the gentlest facts about Saturn. The rings do not perform in a single fixed way. They answer the season, they answer the angle, they answer the patient movement of a planet that takes about 29.5 Earth years to go once around the sun. A season on Saturn lasts for years and years, almost leisurely beyond belief. Spring is not a passing mood there. Summer is not a brief chapter. Light lingers. Shadows stretch themselves out and settle in. The whole system seems to have signed an agreement with time to do everything slowly. Saturn is tilted on its axis, somewhat like Earth, and that tilt is what gives it seasons. It also gives the rings one of their most famous tricks. Because the rings lie around Saturn's equator, that tilt changes how much of their broad surface is lit by the sun and how much of that surface is turned toward us. Sometimes the rings open wide, showing their bright face like a great silver fan. Sometimes they narrow. And sometimes they turn so close to edge-on that they almost disappear, leaving Saturn looking strangely bare. As if you have arrived at exactly the moment a stage curtain became too thin to see. There is something strangely comforting about a structure so enormous being able to vanish like that. Not because it is gone, but because perspective can soften even grand things. The particles keep orbiting. The moons keep tugging. The icy fragments still catch what sunlight reaches them. Yet from the right angle, the rings can become a whisper, a line so fine that observers on Earth must look carefully to notice it at all. Saturn does not stop being beautiful when that happens. It simply becomes quieter. And then slowly the rings open again. Years pass, the angle changes. What had become a slender thread returns to a broad, luminous band. If you followed Saturn over a long enough span of time, you would feel this visual breathing. Open, narrow, open again. A system of ice and gravity gently turning itself through light. The sunlight out at Saturn is much weaker than the sunlight on Earth. By the time it reaches that far edge of the giant planets, it has spread thin across space. Saturn receives only a small fraction of the sunlight Earth does, and yet it is enough to make the rings glow with that unmistakable clarity. That is one of the sweetest tricks in the solar system. Weak light, used beautifully. The ring particles, made mostly of water ice, reflect sunlight so well that even this faint outer illumination can create one of the most graceful sights in astronomy. The brightness changes with geometry. A ring is not a lamp. It reflects more strongly from some angles than others, and different parts of the ring system can appear brighter or darker depending on how the sun strikes them and how you are viewing them. Sometimes the rings look almost white. Sometimes they seem creamy, faintly golden, or gently gray. The differences are subtle, and subtle is exactly Saturn's preferred language. The shadows are just as beautiful as the light. When the rings are tilted relative to the sun, they cast wide, curved shadows onto Saturn's cloud tops. It is one of the loveliest images any spacecraft has ever sent home. A pale planet, softly banded with atmosphere, and across it the dark, elegant arc of its own rings laid like a moving brushstroke. The shadow shifts with the season and with Saturn's position in orbit. Over time it slides, lengthens, changes shape, and reveals the three-dimensional relationship between planet and rings in a way no diagram ever fully can. And Saturn returns the favor. The planet can cast its own shadow onto the rings, darkening part of their broad face and reminding you that this is not a flat picture but a real arrangement of bodies in space, all holding position through motion. The rings give Saturn shade. Saturn gives the rings shade. They seem to understand one another. Around Saturn's equinox, when the sun shines nearly edge-on to the ring plane, the light becomes especially delicate. This is a rare season in Saturn's long year, and it reveals details that are usually hard to see. Because the sun is so low relative to the rings, even small bumps or vertical structures within the ring material can cast long shadows. Features that would normally be almost invisible begin to announce themselves softly through shadow lines and subtle textures. It is a little like watching a landscape at sunrise or sunset on Earth, when low light suddenly makes every ridge and fold stand out. Saturn has its own version of that, only it takes years to unfold and happens on a stage built from ice. Those equinox moments also make the rings appear dimmer overall, because their broad surfaces are no longer catching sunlight in the same generous way. The system becomes more reserved, more secretive, and yet for observers and spacecraft, it can be one of the richest times to look closely, because the lowered light exposes structure that bright illumination can hide. Saturn always seems to reward patience over spectacle. There is another soft little wonder in how the rings brighten when the viewing geometry becomes just right. When the sun is almost directly behind the observer, the shadows cast by individual particles can hide behind the particles themselves, and the rings can appear unusually bright. It is an effect created by countless tiny shadows disappearing from view. That is such a Saturn sort of miracle. Not a flash, not an explosion. Just a field of small hidden shadows, quietly stepping aside so the ice can shine a bit more. Spacecraft like Cassini showed this again and again, that the rings are not one simple color or one simple tone. Different regions scatter light differently. Some parts are dense and brilliant. Some are translucent enough to let light through in a softer way. Some dusty rings glow faintly when lit from behind, like mist catching sunrise. Others look sharper and colder under direct light. The same ring system can feel crisp, gauzy, metallic, or almost feathery depending on where the sun sits and where the camera waits. That changing appearance is part of what makes Saturn feel so restful to revisit. It never becomes ordinary because it is never really the same twice. The planet turns, the seasons progress, the shadows move, the rings open and close. Sunlight travels outward for more than an hour, reaches a field of orbiting ice, and returns carrying a different mood each time. And beneath that changing light, Saturn itself remains an extraordinary partner to the rings. Its upper clouds turn softly under the moving shadows. Its atmosphere holds bands, storms, and winds of its own, subtle from afar but immense in reality. The rings may be the first thing your eye loves, but the world beneath them has its own quiet grandeur, and once you let your gaze slip downward from the bright icy plain to the planet below, you begin to see that Saturn is not simply a beautiful frame for the rings. It is a deep, weathered giant, calm in color, vast in scale, and full of slow-moving mysteries of its own. Once you begin to feel the moons working quietly at the edges, shaping the rings with little repeated touches, the light itself starts to seem more alive too. Saturn is one of those rare places where sunlight does not merely illuminate a scene. It changes the mood of the whole system. The same rings that looked bright and open a while ago can become muted, narrow, golden, pale, almost ghost-like, depending on where the sun is, where Saturn is in its long year, and where you happen to be watching from. That changing light is one of the gentlest facts about Saturn. The rings do not perform in a single fixed way. They answer the season, they answer the angle, they answer the patient movement of a planet that takes about 29.5 Earth years to go once around the sun. A season on Saturn lasts for years and years, almost leisurely beyond belief. Spring is not a passing mood there. Summer is not a brief chapter. Light lingers. Shadows stretch themselves out and settle in. The whole system seems to have signed an agreement with time to do everything slowly. Saturn is tilted on its axis, somewhat like Earth, and that tilt is what gives it seasons. It also gives the rings one of their most famous tricks. Because the rings lie around Saturn's equator, that tilt changes how much of their broad surface is lit by the sun and how much of that surface is turned toward us. Sometimes the rings open wide, showing their bright face like a great silver fan. Sometimes they narrow. And sometimes they turn so close to edge-on that they almost disappear, leaving Saturn looking strangely bare. As if you have arrived at exactly the moment a stage curtain became too thin to see. There is something strangely comforting about a structure so enormous being able to vanish like that. Not because it is gone, but because perspective can soften even grand things. The particles keep orbiting. The moons keep tugging. The icy fragments still catch what sunlight reaches them. Yet from the right angle, the rings can become a whisper, a line so fine that observers on Earth must look carefully to notice it at all. Saturn does not stop being beautiful when that happens. It simply becomes quieter. And then slowly the rings open again. Years pass. The angle changes. What had become a slender thread returns to a broad, luminous band. If you followed Saturn over a long enough span of time, you would feel this visual breathing. Open, narrow, open again. A system of ice and gravity gently turning itself through light. The sunlight out at Saturn is much weaker than the sunlight on Earth. By the time it reaches that far edge of the giant planets, it has spread thin across space. Saturn receives only a small fraction of the sunlight Earth does, and yet it is enough to make the rings glow with that unmistakable clarity. That is one of the sweetest tricks in the solar system. Weak light, used beautifully. The ring particles, made mostly of water ice, reflect sunlight so well that even this faint outer illumination can create one of the most graceful sights in astronomy. The brightness changes with geometry. A ring is not a lamp. It reflects more strongly from some angles than others, and different parts of the ring system can appear brighter or darker depending on how the sun strikes them and how you are viewing them. Sometimes the rings look almost white. Sometimes they seem creamy, faintly golden, or gently gray. The differences are subtle, and subtle is exactly Saturn's preferred language. The shadows are just as beautiful as the light. When the rings are tilted relative to the sun, they cast wide, curved shadows onto Saturn's cloud tops. It is one of the loveliest images any spacecraft has ever sent home. A pale planet, softly banded with atmosphere, and across it the dark, elegant arc of its own rings laid like a moving brushstroke. The shadow shifts with the season and with Saturn's position in orbit. Over time it slides, lengthens, changes shape, and reveals the three-dimensional relationship between planet and rings in a way no diagram ever fully can. And Saturn returns the favor. The planet can cast its own shadow onto the rings, darkening part of their broad face and reminding you that this is not a flat picture but a real arrangement of bodies in space, all holding position through motion. The rings give Saturn shade. Saturn gives the rings shade. They seem to understand one another. Around Saturn's equinox, when the sun shines nearly edge-on to the ring plane, the light becomes especially delicate. This is a rare season in Saturn's long year, and it reveals details that are usually hard to see. Because the sun is so low relative to the rings, even small bumps or vertical structures within the ring material can cast long shadows. Features that would normally be almost invisible begin to announce themselves softly through shadow lines and subtle textures. It is a little like watching a landscape at sunrise or sunset on Earth, when low light suddenly makes every ridge and fold stand out. Saturn has its own version of that, only it takes years to unfold and happens on a stage built from ice. Those equinox moments also make the rings appear dimmer overall, because their broad surfaces are no longer catching sunlight in the same generous way. The system becomes more reserved, more secretive, and yet for observers and spacecraft, it can be one of the richest times to look closely, because the lowered light exposes structure that bright illumination can hide. Saturn always seems to reward patience over spectacle. There is another soft little wonder in how the rings brighten when the viewing geometry becomes just right. When the sun is almost directly behind the observer, the shadows cast by individual particles can hide behind the particles themselves, and the rings can appear unusually bright. It is an effect created by countless tiny shadows disappearing from view. That is such a Saturn sort of miracle. Not a flash, not an explosion. Just a field of small hidden shadows, quietly stepping aside so the ice can shine a bit more. Spacecraft like Cassini showed this again and again, that the rings are not one simple color or one simple tone. Different regions scatter light differently. Some parts are dense and brilliant. Some are translucent enough to let light through in a softer way. Some dusty rings glow faintly when lit from behind, like mist catching sunrise. Others look sharper and colder under direct light. The same ring system can feel crisp, gauzy, metallic, or almost feathery depending on where the sun sits and where the camera waits. That changing appearance is part of what makes Saturn feel so restful to revisit. It never becomes ordinary because it is never really the same twice. The planet turns, the seasons progress, the shadows move, the rings open and close. Sunlight travels outward for more than an hour, reaches a field of orbiting ice, and returns carrying a different mood each time. And beneath that changing light, Saturn itself remains an extraordinary partner to the rings. Its upper clouds turn softly under the moving shadows. Its atmosphere holds bands, storms, and winds of its own, subtle from afar but immense in reality. The rings may be the first thing your eye loves, but the world beneath them has its own quiet grandeur, and once you let your gaze slip downward from the bright icy plane to the planet below, you begin to see that Saturn is not simply a beautiful frame for the rings. It is a deep, weathered giant, calm in color, vast in scale, and full of slow-moving mysteries of its own. By the time that thought begins to settle, the whole view of Saturn changes again, and it changes in one of the most beautiful ways yet. You are no longer only looking at the rings as they are. You are looking at them as something passing through time, still immense, still luminous, still floating there with that almost impolite elegance, but no longer feeling eternal in the casual way a child might imagine them. The rings begin to feel like a moment, and that makes them more precious, not less. It is one of the softest and strangest truths in astronomy that the most iconic feature of Saturn may not have always looked like this, and may not always remain this way. Saturn itself is ancient, formed more than 4 billion years ago, back in the early days of the solar system when planets were assembling out of dust, gas, collisions, heat, and long stretches of chaos slowly learning structure. The planet is old in that deep planetary sense, older than mountains on Earth, older than oceans as we know them, older than almost anything the human mind naturally handles without needing to sit very still for a while. And yet the rings may be much younger. Astronomers are still working through that mystery with great care, because Saturn likes to keep things elegant and slightly unresolved. Some evidence suggests the rings may be relatively young compared with the planet, perhaps formed from the destruction of an icy moon or a comet-like body that wandered too close and was torn apart by Saturn's gravity. Other ideas allow for greater age, with long-term processes renewing or reshaping the ring material over time. The details remain open in some ways, but what matters tonight is the feeling science leaves you with. These rings are not necessarily a permanent crown placed on Saturn for all of cosmic history. They may be the result of change, of loss, of transformation, of one form becoming another. That thought could sound sad if handled badly, but Saturn does not ask for sadness. It asks for tenderness. Because if the rings came from a broken, icy world, then what you are seeing now is not destruction frozen in place. It is matter rearranged into grace. Pieces once gathered in one shape now gathered in another, all of them catching sunlight, all of them circling together, all of them turned into something so beautiful that from Earth it can stop people in their tracks. There is a quiet comfort in that. The solar system does not always preserve things by keeping them unchanged. Sometimes it preserves beauty by changing its form. The brightness of the rings has encouraged many scientists to think they may be younger than Saturn itself, because bright icy material does not stay bright forever. Dust drifts through the solar system. Tiny dark particles settle over long stretches of time. Space has a way of gently dirtying everything. If the rings had been left untouched for billions and billions of years, some researchers argue they might appear darker than they do now. Their current shine suggests either that they are younger, or that something about the system has refreshed them, mixed them, or helped expose cleaner ice over time. Saturn, as usual, prefers not to answer too quickly. And even if the rings are relatively young by planetary standards, young in this context is still wonderfully vast. We are not talking about a recent little event with a fresh timestamp. We are talking about spans of time so large they make human history look like a blink someone almost forgot to finish. A ring system can be young and still have been glowing in space long before the first city on Earth learned how to hold a wall upright. Saturn is very good at reminding you that cosmic time and human time are not even slightly on the same schedule. There is another reason the rings feel temporary, and it may be the most delicate fact of all. They are slowly changing even now. Tiny particles from the rings can be pulled by electromagnetic forces and gravity into Saturn's upper atmosphere in a process sometimes described as ring rain. It is exactly as gentle and melancholy as it sounds. Material from the rings does not stay forever where it is. Some of it gradually falls inward along Saturn's magnetic field lines, feeding the planet bit by bit. Ice and dust that once shone in the halo can end up becoming part of the world below. That process is not a dramatic collapse. It is slow, subtle, patient, very Saturn, but it means the rings are not a static inheritance that can simply be taken for granted. They are being worn down over time, even as moons shape them, sunlight brightens them, and collisions continue to rearrange the particles. A ring system is not a monument. It is an active phase. And because it is a phase, we happen to live in a remarkable window. Human beings appeared in the solar system during an era when Saturn has large, bright rings that are easy to admire through telescopes and spacecraft images. That is not guaranteed forever. In the very long future, the rings may thin, darken, disperse, or change so much that Saturn will look different to whoever happens to be watching then. There is something deeply calming in that realization, because it turns our view into a privilege rather than an entitlement. We did not arrive too late. We arrived while the light was still on. That does not make Saturn fragile in a weak way. It makes it alive in time. The rings are part of a story still unfolding, shaped by breakups, collisions, gravity, dust, moons, and the slow inward drift of material. The gaps you passed earlier, the ringlets, the waves, the sharp edges held by shepherd moons, the faint dusty regions glowing in backlight, All of them belong to a system that is not finished. You are not looking at a completed object sealed in glass. You are looking at a chapter still being written. And perhaps that is why Saturn feels so different from a picture in a book. The longer you stay with it, the less it feels like a symbol and the more it feels like an event. A very slow event, yes. An event so patient that it can wear the same face for centuries and still be changing underneath. But change is there. Ice grinds softly. Particles collide. Light comes and goes with the seasons. Shadows move over the cloud tops. Ring material drifts inward. Moons continue their steady shaping. Time keeps touching the whole system without ever raising its voice. It is almost impossible not to love Saturn more once you know that. Permanence can be majestic, but impermanence has its own kind of glow. The rings are beautiful because they are wide and bright and delicately structured. They are even more beautiful because they may belong to a rare interval, a suspended moment in the life of a giant planet, a moment long enough for civilizations to rise and fall beneath it, yet still only a moment when compared with the age of worlds. So you remain there a little longer, holding the image gently. A giant planet older than almost anything you can emotionally measure. A halo of icy particles perhaps born from a broken moon. Sunlight arriving after a long outward journey, glancing off frozen fragments and returning across space to reach human eyes. Material slowly raining inward. Shape slowly changing. Beauty not weakened by time but deepened by it. And from that wider perspective, Saturn becomes more than a planet with rings. It becomes a lesson in balance, in timing, in the strange softness of things that do not last forever. The grandeur remains, but it has become more personal now, quieter and somehow closer, which is exactly where this journey has been heading all along. By the time you have stayed with Saturn this long, the planet no longer feels like a distant picture in a textbook. It feels inhabited by rhythm, not by life in the ordinary sense, and not by sound, but by patterns so steady and so graceful that it begins to feel almost familiar. The rings are still there, wide and bright and improbably thin. The moons are still moving in their measured paths. The pale atmosphere is still turning beneath those crystal bands. But the deepest calm comes from realizing that none of it is separate. Saturn is not a planet wearing rings like an accessory. Saturn is a whole system of relationships, a place where light, gravity, motion, ice, shadow, and time have learned how to share the same stage without stepping on each other's lines. That may be the most relaxing fact of all. You began with a simple image, that first impossible silhouette, a golden planet with a halo around it, hanging far away in darkness as if the universe had briefly become elegant on purpose. Then the details started arriving softly. The rings were not solid. They were made of countless pieces. The calm surface turned out to be motion. The bright bands opened into ringlets and gaps. The gaps turned out not to be empty in any blunt way, but shaped by repeated tugs, subtle resonances, and the quiet influence of moons. Light changed with season. Shadows crossed cloud tops. The planet below the rings revealed storms, winds, and that strange hexagon resting at the pole like a thought Saturn forgot to explain. And through it all, the rings kept becoming more delicate, not less, the closer you came to understanding them. That is one of the nicest things about Saturn. It rewards attention without punishing simplicity. You can love it from very far away. You can love it because it looks graceful. And if you stay longer, if you give it the gift of patience, it gives something back. The science does not strip away the beauty, it deepens it. The facts do not make Saturn colder. They make it warmer in the mind, more textured, more real, more tender. You can feel that tenderness most clearly when you remember that quiet ring rain from earlier, the slow inward fall of material from the halo to the planet below. A ring particle catches sunlight for ages, circles in that luminous plane, and one day begins a different journey. Or think of the possibility that the rings themselves may have come from a lost icy moon, broken apart and reshaped into brilliance. Saturn keeps taking things that could sound harsh if told badly and turning them into something gentler. Change becomes form, loss becomes structure, motion becomes serenity. And still, nothing about Saturn feels sentimental. It is too vast for that, too composed, too honest about its own scale. This is a giant planet nearly 1.5 billion kilometers from the Sun, circled by a system of rings so wide they could swallow worlds in width, and yet so thin they can nearly vanish from view. It is orbited by moons that sculpt edges and stir waves. It wears weather broad enough to stretch around the globe. It turns quickly, carries long seasons, and lets sunlight arrive weak and distant, only to transform that thin light into one of the most beautiful scenes in the solar system. Saturn does not need exaggeration. It is already operating at a level where understatement somehow feels more accurate. Perhaps that is why it has such a calming effect. Nothing there looks rushed. Even the fast things look slow because the scale is so vast. Even the changes that matter take years, centuries, or far longer to show themselves fully. The rings circle with great speed, yet from a distance they seem almost still. Shadows move across the atmosphere, but with such patience that they feel ceremonial. Moons tug at the rings over and over until a gap or wave appears, and the result looks less like force than like refinement. Everything at Saturn seems to have accepted that beauty takes time. There is something you can borrow from that. You do not need to live among ring particles or drift over cloud tops to feel the lesson. You only need to keep the image nearby. A great bright system held together not by hurry, not by noise, not by brute drama, but by steady laws repeating themselves over time. Tiny influences matter, small nudges matter, angles matter, light matters, distance matters, patience matters. Saturn is magnificent, but it is magnificent through consistency, through the long, calm accumulation of quiet forces. And there is comfort in remembering how perspective changed everything. When the rings were open, they looked broad and radiant. When they turned edge-on, they almost disappeared. The structure itself had not vanished, only the view had changed. That feels important in a human way, though Saturn never asks for human interpretation. Things can remain beautiful even when they are harder to see. Things can remain real even when they become subtle. A thin line can still hold an enormous world of detail. So you return finally to that first distant sight, but you return differently. You are no longer looking at Saturn as a symbol of wonder in the abstract. You are looking at a real giant planet wrapped in ice and motion, carrying seasons, storms, shadows, moons, and a slowly changing ring system through the dark. The wonder has become calmer now, more grounded, more generous. It no longer depends on surprise alone. It rests on understanding, and understanding has made the scene feel even softer. Maybe that is the best place to leave Saturn, not as a riddle solved, and not as a mystery reduced, but as a world whose beauty became richer each time you looked again. A pale globe, a shining plain of ice, a family of moons, a deep atmosphere under silent arcs of shadow, a place where even emptiness has structure, where even weak sunlight can become radiance, and where time itself seems to move with extraordinary manners. You could stay there a little longer if you like, just long enough to watch the rings hold their line around the planet, long enough to imagine those countless icy fragments continuing on through the dark, each on its own path, all together making something that seems, from the right distance, impossibly calm. And with that image still resting quietly in your mind, you can allow the whole scene to grow softer around the edges. Saturn remains where it has always been, turning slowly through the black, its rings stretched around it like a silver breath that never fully fades. The moons continue their patient circling. The shadows remain gentle. The light remains thin and kind. There is nothing more you need to solve tonight. You have already gone far enough to see how beauty can be built from little pieces, how motion can look like stillness when it is balanced well, and how even a distant giant planet can feel calm when you stay with it long enough. Saturn does not ask you to keep up with it. It does not demand anything at all. It simply goes on being itself, far away, composed, luminous, and quiet. So you can leave it there, hanging in that dark with all its pale grace intact. The rings are still glinting softly. The planet is still carrying its weather beneath them. The long Saturnian seasons are still passing with no need to announce themselves. Everything is continuing exactly as it should, whether you are watching or not. And maybe that is the most peaceful thought to end on. Out there beyond the inner warmth of the solar system, Saturn keeps its beautiful order. Ice circles, moons guide, shadows drift. Light arrives late and does its work anyway. Nothing hurries, nothing strains. The whole scene holds. So your mind can grow quiet too. You can let the rings become a thin line of silver in the distance. You can let the planet soften into gold and cream. You can let the darkness around it widen into rest. And somewhere far away, very calmly, Saturn keeps shining.